At the end of October 1589, in the small town of Bedberg, near Cologne, an event took place that would go down in history as one of the most horrific court cases of the witch-hunting era. Peter Stubba, a wealthy middle-aged farmer, was sentenced to death for crimes so monstrous that even the inhabitants of the Holy Roman Empire, hardened by war and plague, shuddered with horror. The charges included murder, cannibalism, incest, and werewolfry. The execution lasted several hours, and each stage was carefully documented by the town clerks. Few of his contemporaries questioned the fairness of the sentence. The case of Peter Stubba served as a warning to the entire region, proof that evil can hide behind the guise of an honest Christian. But outside the official chronicles, there are details that make us wonder about the nature of those events, about what really happened in the forests around Bedberg during the 25 years that the murders continued. Today we will tell you this story. If you are listening to us from the comfort of your warm and safe home, appreciate it. Because at the end of the 16th century, there was no safety anywhere in the German lands. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's begin. Peter Stubba was born in 1525 in a village near Bedberg to a wealthy farmer. From an early age, he was distinguished by his strong physique and extraordinary strength, which helped him in his work on the land. By the age of 30, he had inherited his father's farm. Several acres of arable land, a small flock of sheep, and a house with a stone foundation. By the standards of the time and place, he was a wealthy man. Neighbors described him as a reserved but polite man who regularly attended church, paid his taxes, and did not participate in village squabbles. He was married and had 2 children, a son and a daughter. His wife died of fever in 1553, after which he remarried. Nothing in his behavior revealed what was going on behind the closed doors of his home. The first disappearance occurred in the spring of 1564. A 12-year-old girl from a neighboring village went to gather firewood in the forest and did not return. The search lasted 3 days, but only her basket was found at the edge of the forest. The body was never found. It was decided that the child had gotten lost and died of cold, or was torn apart by wolves. There were large predators in those forests. Over the next 2 years, 3 more children disappeared. All the cases were similar. The children went into the forest alone or in small groups and did not return. Sometimes they found scraps of clothing, sometimes bloody footprints. Once they found what was left of a body, mutilated remains that were barely recognizable as human. The local priest declared that it was the work of a wild animal, possibly a bear or pack of wolves. But the peasants began to whisper. They said that beasts don't act like that the wounds were inflicted by something that knew where to strike to cause the most suffering, that some parts of the bodies were completely missing, as if someone had taken them away. They talked about a curse, about something in the woods that was better left unnamed. Peter Stubba continued to run his farm during those years. He often went into the forest to check his hair traps, chop wood, and gather mushrooms. Neighbors saw him returning from the hunt with his prey slung over his shoulder. Deer, wild boars, sometimes wolves. He was a skilled hunter and knew the forest like the back of his hand. In 1567, a pregnant woman disappeared. She was found a week later in a ravine 3 miles from the village. What had been done to her was so horrific that the priest forbade anyone but the gravediggers from looking at the body. Her stomach had been cut open, and the baby was gone. According to those who saw her, the woman was still alive when it started. Traces on the ground showed that she had tried to crawl away. Panic swept through the district. The men began to organize patrols, going into the forest in groups with weapons. Several times they saw a large wolf, gray, almost black, the size of a calf. The beast watched them from a distance, showing no fear. When shot at with crossbows, it disappeared into the thicket with incredible speed. One of the hunters, old Hans from Bedberg, swore that he saw the wolf stand on its hind legs like a man before disappearing. He was laughed at, but whispers about the cursed beast, the demon in wolf's clothing, began to spread. The killings continued. Once every few months, sometimes more often. The victims were children, women, and less often men, always in or near the forest, always with signs of extreme cruelty. By 1570, the number of missing and murdered had reached dozens. The local authorities were powerless. The mayor of Bedberg sent petitions to Cologne asking for soldiers to be sent to hunt down the beast or the criminal. But war was raging, resources were scarce, and the peasants' complaints about the murders in the forest did not seem a priority. They were advised to hire hunters and deal with it themselves. Peter Stubba became even more withdrawn during these years. His second wife died in childbirth in 1572, and the child did not survive. After that, he lived alone with his daughter, who was about 15 years old at the time. His son left for Cologne to learn a trade and rarely visited his father. The neighbors noticed something strange. Peter was often absent at night. He said he was hunting, but rarely brought home any game. Strange sounds sometimes came from his house, moans, cries, something between crying and howling. When asked, he explained it away as nightmares or pain from old wounds. His daughter, Belle, began to avoid people. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she kept to the shadows, wrapped in a shawl even on hot days. The women of the village tried to talk to her, but the girl looked away and ran away. Once the pastor came to visit them, but Peter did not let him pass the threshold, saying that his daughter was unwell and could not receive guests. In 1575, a murder occurred that was different from the others. A young man, the son of a blacksmith, was found dead on the road between villages, a quarter of a mile from the forest. His throat had been cut, but his body was not mutilated like the other victims. A blood-stained knife lay nearby. Traces indicated that there had been a struggle. This was the first death not in the forest, and it changed everything. People realized that the killer was not a beast, but a human being. Beasts do not use knives. Beasts do not leave weapons at the scene of the crime. The interrogations began. The authorities summoned all the men from the surrounding villages who were capable of wielding a weapon, one after another. They asked where they had been that night, whether there were any witnesses, and what their relationship with the victim had been. Peter Stubba was also summoned. He calmly replied that he had been at home, asleep. There were no witnesses. He lived alone with his daughter, who confirmed his words. He was released, but suspicions began to mount. Several people recalled seeing Peter in the forest on the days when people disappeared. One hunter said that he once met Peter deep in the thicket, in a place where few people ventured, and that Peter had a strange smile on his face, and his hands were covered in blood. Peter explained that he was cutting up a deer, but there was no carcass nearby. Another woman said she saw Peter watching children playing with an expression on his face that frightened her. Not an evil look, but a hungry, greedy look, as if he saw not children, but pieces of meat. But these were all rumors and suspicions, nothing concrete. In those days, people believed in witchcraft and werewolves, but the law required evidence, and there was no evidence. The turning point came in the fall of 1589. A group of hunters with dogs were chasing a large deer in the forest north of Bedberg. The dogs picked up the scent, and the hunters followed them for about an hour, going deeper and deeper into the thicket. Suddenly the dog stopped, began to bark and whine, but refused to go any further. The hunters approached and saw a large gray wolf standing in the ferns. The beast stared at them, motionless, showing no fear. It was the very wolf of legend, huge, with yellowish fur on its muzzle and a scar across its left eye. One of the hunters, Georg, raised his crossbow and fired. The bolt hit the wolf in the side, and the beast howled and ran. But it did not run deep into the forest. As expected, it ran toward the village. The hunters and dogs pursued it. The bloody trail was clearly visible on the leaves and grass. They ran for almost a mile, and the wolf gradually slowed down, stumbled, but continued to move forward with a persistence that seemed almost human. Finally, the trail led them to the edge of the village, to the fence of one of the houses. The hunters stopped and looked at each other. It was Peter Stubba's house. They walked around the house and found the back door ajar. Bloody footprints led inside. Georg was the first to enter the house, holding his crossbow at the ready. In the dim light of the room, he saw a figure sitting on the floor by the hearth. It was Peter Stubba. He was naked from the waist up, and there was a gaping wound in his side, exactly where the crossbow bolt had struck. The wound was bleeding, but not as much as it should have been. Peter was holding a rag in his hands, trying to stop the blood. When the hunters entered, he raised his head and looked at them. His face was calm, almost peaceful. Georg asked where the wound came from. Peter replied that he had cut himself while working with an axe. Georg pointed to the bloody trail leading from the door. Peter remained silent. Then the hunters searched the house. In the basement, under the floorboards, they found things. Clothes. Children's, women's, men's. Dozens of items, some of which were identified as belonging to missing people. Bones hidden in bags, a knife with a long blade covered with old stains, and a belt made of wolfskin, strange, with metal plates sewn into it, on which symbols were engraved. Peter Stubba was arrested on the spot. He was taken to the city prison in Bedberg, where he was to await trial. News of the arrest spread instantly. People gathered at the prison demanding immediate execution. The mayor called in additional security to prevent vigilante justice. The investigation began the next day. Peter was questioned by 3 judges who had come from Cologne especially for this case. At first, he denied everything. He said that the items in his house were things he had found in the forest, that he had collected them without knowing who they belonged to, that the wound was indeed the result of an accident, that he was an honest Christian, a hard-working farmer, and that these accusations were a terrible mistake. But then the torture began. In those days, torture was a standard part of the judicial process, especially in cases of witchcraft and devilry. Peter Stubba was stretched on the rack. His fingers were crushed with iron pincers, and he was burned with red-hot iron. After 3 days of torture, he began to talk. His confession was so horrific that the judges ordered every word to be recorded. These records were preserved and later published in a pamphlet that was distributed throughout Europe. Peter Stubba recounted that at the age of 12, he met a man in a black cloak in the forest. This man offered him power, promising that Peter would become the strongest man alive and that no one would ever be able to harm him. In exchange, he had to renounce God and serve the devil. Peter, being young and foolish, agreed. The man in black gave him a belt made of wolfskin and said that when Peter put on this belt, he would turn into a wolf, a strong, fast, invulnerable wolf that could do whatever it wanted without punishment. Peter said that the first transformation was painful. His bones broke and rearranged themselves, his skin became covered with fur, and his face stretched into a snout. But the pain passed, and all that remained was a feeling of freedom and strength. In the form of a wolf, he could run faster than the wind, see in the dark, and smell scents from a mile away. And he could kill. His first victim, he said, was a girl who was herding geese at the edge of the forest. She was about 10 years old. Peter, in the form of a wolf, tracked her down, pounced on her, and bit through her throat. The taste of blood was so sweet, so intoxicating, that he couldn't stop. He said he ate parts of her body and hid the rest in the bushes. After that, the killings became regular. Every few weeks, sometimes more often, he would put on the belt, turn into a wolf, and go hunting. He preferred children. They were weaker and easier to catch. But sometimes he killed adults if they were alone in the forest. He recounted details that made even hardened judges turn pale. How he cut open the stomachs of pregnant women and devoured babies straight from the womb. How he caught small children and slowly tore them apart, enjoying their screams. How he ate the hearts and livers of his victims, believing it would give him even more strength. The judges asked about the number of victims. Peter said that in 25 years he had killed at least 16 people, but he did not remember the exact number. It could have been more. Then he talked about his family. about how he had seduced his own daughter, Belle, when she was 13, that she had given birth to his child, whom he killed and ate immediately after birth, that he had a mistress, Catherine, who knew about his deeds, and even helped him sometimes by luring victims into traps. He said that he had killed his own son several years ago. The boy had begun to suspect his father and was asking too many questions. Peter lured him into the forest, turned into a wolf, and tore his skull apart. He ate parts of the body and buried the rest in a swamp. The confession lasted 2 days. By the end, Peter Stubba was exhausted from torture, barely able to stand, but he continued to speak with a sense of relief, as if he was glad to finally speak his mind and free himself from the burden of his secrets. Based on his confession, Belle Stubba and Catherine Trompin were arrested. They were also interrogated with prejudice. At first, both denied everything, but after torture, they confessed. Belle confirmed her incestuous relationship with her father and told about the child he had killed. Catherine confessed that she knew about Peter's nature and helped him lure victims by promising them work or food. The trial lasted only 1 day. There was more than enough evidence. All 3 were found guilty of witchcraft, murder, incest, cannibalism, and conspiracy with the devil. The verdict was unanimous: death for all 3. But the nature of Peter Stubba's punishment had to reflect the monstrosity of his crimes. The judges ruled that his death should be long and painful to serve as an example to all who might succumb to the temptation of dark forces. The execution was set for October 28, 1589. The scaffold was built in the square in the center of Bedberg. Several hundred people gathered, residents of the town and surrounding villages, many of whom had lost loved ones at the hands of Peter Stubba. In the morning, Peter was taken from prison to be executed. His face was emaciated, his body covered with wounds from torture, but he walked steadily, asking for no mercy, praying not at all. He looked straight ahead with a detached expression. The execution began with breaking on the wheel. Peter was tied to a large wooden wheel, his limbs stretched out. The executioner took an iron rod with a rounded end, heated red hot. In the presence of the judges and the priest, he began to methodically break Peter's bones. First his arms, starting with his fingers, then his wrists, forearms and shoulders, then his legs, his toes, feet, shins, and thighs. Each blow caused the crunch of breaking bone and a groan. Peter did not scream, but moaned softly through clenched teeth. The crowd watched in silence. Some looked away, others stared intently, as if hypnotized by horror. After the bones were broken, the executioner took red-hot tongs and began to tear pieces of flesh from Peter's body. First from his arms, then from his legs, chest, and back. The smell of burnt flesh filled the square. Some spectators began to move away, covering their mouths. This stage of the execution lasted more than an hour. Peter was still alive, still conscious, although his moans had become quieter and weaker. His body had been reduced to a bloody mess, but his heart was still beating. Finally, the executioner took an axe and chopped Peter's head off with one blow. The head was impaled on a stake which was erected in the square as a warning. An image of a wolf carved from wood was attached above the head, so that everyone would remember the nature of his crimes. Peter's body was placed on a pyre along with the bodies of Belle and Catherine, who had been executed separately by hanging and strangulation. The pyre burned all day, reducing the bodies to ashes. The ashes were collected and scattered over the river, so that nothing remained that could become an object of worship or curse. The wolfskin belt, which Peter claimed gave him the ability to turn into a wolf, was never found. Peter claimed that when he was arrested, the belt disappeared, returning to the one who gave it to him, the man in black, the devil. Some considered this to be the ravings of a tortured man, while others believed that the belt truly possessed dark powers and had been taken back to hell. After Peter Stubba's execution, the murders in the forests around Bedberg ceased. Over the next few years, not a single similar case was reported. For most residents, this was proof that the true culprit had been caught and punished. But there were those who had their doubts. Some hunters claimed that they still saw a large gray wolf deep in the forest, watching them from a distance. Others said they heard howls at night that were unlike those of a normal wolf, too loud, too drawn out, almost human. The story of Peter Stubba spread far beyond Bedberg. Pamphlets describing his crimes and execution were printed in Cologne, Frankfurt, London, and Amsterdam. His case was cited in treatises on witchcraft and demonology, becoming one of the most famous examples of werewolfism in Europe. Modern historians argue about the true nature of Peter Stubba's crimes. Some believe that he was indeed a serial killer and cannibal, a man with severe mental disorders who used the superstitions of his time to explain his actions. His confession to werewolfism may have been the result of torture, delirium, or even a sincere belief that he possessed supernatural abilities. Others suggest that the case was fabricated, that Peter Stubba became a scapegoat for all the unsolved murders in the area over a period of 25 years. At that time, witch hunts and the persecution of the possessed were at their peak, and sometimes innocent people were accused of monstrous crimes based on rumors and testimony obtained under torture. But facts remain facts. Belongings of missing people were found in Peter Stubba's basement. His wound matched the wound inflicted on the wolf. His confession, even if it was made under torture, contained details that matched the circumstances of the murders. And most importantly, after his execution, the murders stopped. Peter Stubba's house was burned to the ground immediately after his execution. The land on which it stood was declared cursed, and nothing was built there for many decades. It was only in the 18th century, when more than 100 years had passed and the memory of the events had faded, that a new house was built on this site. The forest around Bedberg is still considered by locals to be a gloomy and dangerous place. Although modern roads and trails make it more accessible, old-timers still warn against venturing deep into the thicket alone, especially at night. They say that sometimes strange sounds can be heard there, that travelers see a large wolf staring at them with yellow eyes and then disappearing. The story of Peter Stubba remains one of the most gruesome in the annals of European criminal history. It reminds us that evil can take many forms, real and imagined, human and supernatural. It shows how easily fear and superstition can turn a person into a monster in the eyes of society, and how thin the line between justice and cruelty can be. Was Peter Stubba really a werewolf who made a deal with the devil? Or was he just a mad killer whose crimes were interpreted through the prism of the superstitions of his time? We will never know for sure. But one thing is certain. On October 28, 1589, something terrible happened in Bedberg that left a scar on the history of this place, a scar that has not healed to this day. If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and write in the comments where you are listening to us from. See you in the next episode.